Have you ever been afraid of something that, rationally, made absolutely no sense? That strange feeling in your chest when you hear an ordinary noise. Your heart racing before a simple conversation. The feeling that something bad is going to happen, even when everything seems normal. Have you ever experienced this? If so, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you, and perhaps change the way you understand fear itself. Imagine the scene. You're at home at night, everything is silent. Suddenly, a cracking sound comes from another room. In fractions of a second your body reacts. Shortness of breath, tense muscles, maximum attention. Your brain goes into full alert mode as if a real danger were about to happen. But seconds later you realize, it was just the wind. Or the wood adjusting. Nothing was really wrong. Still the fear was real. Your body felt it. The threat seemed concrete. Now think about this. If there was no danger, why did your brain react as if there was? This question leads us to one of the most intriguing and perplexing phenomena in human functioning. There is a silent flaw, deeply rooted in our biology, that causes the brain to overestimate threats. It sees risks where none exist, amplifies neutral signals, and transforms uncertainties into catastrophic scenarios. And the most unsettling thing is, this happens without you realizing it. The brain doesn't wait for proof. It anticipates. It predicts. It tries to protect you even before you understand what's happening. And often this protection gets out of control. A simple look can seem hostile. An unanswered message becomes rejection. A small mistake turns into imminent disaster. The danger isn't in the outside world, it's in the interpretation the brain silently constructs. Have you ever noticed how fear arises before conscious thought? First the body reacts, then the mind tries to justify it. This is no coincidence. It's an ancient, automatic system shaped for survival. A system that doesn't ask if the fear makes sense, it just triggers. And when it's wrong on the large side. Because, for the brain, it's always better to exaggerate than to ignore a potential threat. The problem is that this mechanism originated in a world very different from ours. A world where every shadow could hide a predator. Where hesitation meant not surviving. Today the environment has changed, but the brain continues to operate with the same primitive logic. It doesn't clearly differentiate between a real danger and an imagined one. It reacts to the feeling of threat, not to objective reality. And that's where things get deeper. Because this flaw doesn't just affect momentary fear. It shapes decisions, behaviors, relationships, and even how you see yourself. How many opportunities have you avoided because you felt something didn't seem safe? How many times has your brain told you a scary story, and you believed it? Perhaps you're starting to realize something important now. The fear you feel isn't always a reliable warning. Sometimes it's just a reflection of a system that tries to protect you but ends up limiting you. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the fear, but it reveals its origin. And knowledge changes everything. This is precisely the kind of questioning that guides the philosophy behind dark human science. Looking behind the scenes of the human mind and exposing the invisible mechanisms that shape our perception of reality. Not to simplify but to provoke. To unsettle. To make you see beyond your first reaction. And as we move forward, one question becomes impossible to ignore. If the brain can exaggerate threats so easily, how many of your fears were never real? Take a deep breath. Because now that this door has been opened, what comes next will take us even deeper into this silent error of the mind. The one that sets off alarms even before there is a fire. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, some memory has already surfaced. A specific moment. An exaggerated reaction. A fear that appeared out of nowhere and took over, even without a clear reason. If this is happening now, don't ignore it. Stop for a second and realize, this is not just theory, it's real human experience. That you've been through this before, haven't you? And it's precisely here that the conversation stops being just mine and becomes ours. Because when you share what you felt, what you experienced, or even what you don't yet fully understand, this content gains another layer. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. A recurring fear, a strange situation, or even that feeling that's hard to explain. Sometimes, writing is already the first step towards seeing things more clearly. And if at any point during this video you thought, this is important, liking something isn't just an automatic click. It's a signal. A simple way of saying that this kind of reflection needs to reach more people. People who might be feeling confused, anxious, or trapped by fears they don't even know where they come from. Your participation here really makes a difference. Now, if you feel that this content speaks to something deeper, if it sparks curiosity, discomfort, or that desire to better understand your own mind, subscribing is almost a silent pact. I want to continue exploring this. Because that's how this community grows. People who don't accept easy answers and want to look at the human brain without filters. And while you do that, comment, like, subscribe, we'll continue together. Because what we're beginning to reveal here is just the surface. From here, we'll delve even deeper into this mechanism that distorts perception, triggers false alarms, and makes the brain see threats where they may never have existed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when we start to observe carefully, we realize that this phenomenon is much more common and more influential than it seems at first glance. The brain doesn't react to the world as it is. It reacts to the world as believes that he is. This difference seems subtle, almost philosophical, but it changes everything. Between what happens outside and what you feel inside, there is an invisible space where the brain interprets, fills in gaps, creates hypotheses, and makes decisions silently. It is in this space that failure is born. It is there that an imagined threat can gain the same weight as a real threat. Think about it for a moment. Two people go through exactly the same situation. The same environment, the same words, the same context. One moves on normally. The other feels a tightness in their chest, a discomfort difficult to explain, an urgency they don't know where it came from. What changed wasn't the world. It was the interpretation their brain made of it. And that interpretation isn't always fair, accurate, or true. The most intriguing thing is that this process happens too quickly to be noticed. Before any conscious thought forms, the body has already responded. The heart races, breathing changes, muscles contract. Only then does the mind try to find a logical explanation. It's as if the brain were saying, "First I protect you, then we'll talk." And often that conversation never really happens. That's why we feel fear even before we think. Because the brain operates in layers. There's the layer of reason, of analysis, of language. But there's a deeper, older layer that doesn't wait for arguments. It works with signals, patterns, and associations. A tone of voice, an unexpected silence, a neutral expression are enough to trigger the alarm. Not because they represent real danger, but because they look alike with something that, at some point, was recorded as a threat. And here emerges a hidden truth that almost no one realizes. The brain prefers to err on the side of caution. For it, interpreting something neutral as dangerous is less risky than interpreting something dangerous as neutral. This logic has shaped our survival throughout evolution, but it exacts a high price in modern life. Today, danger is rarely physical. It is symbolic, social, emotional. Yet, the brain reacts as if it were facing something that needs to be avoided at all costs. This constant exaggeration creates a silent impact. It influences decisions, both small and large. It makes you avoid important conversations, postpone necessary changes, and distrust situations that could lead to transformation. The brain constructs internal narratives that seem convincing, but don't always correspond to the facts. Stories that say, "This isn't safe, it's better not to risk it, something bad might happen." And, without realizing it, you begin to live within these stories. The most curious thing is that, when we look back, many of these fears never materialized. The disaster didn't happen. The rejection didn't come. The danger didn't exist. Even so, the body reacted as if everything were real. This happens because the brain doesn't work with absolute truths, but with emotional probabilities. It calculates what can it goes wrong, and they act as if it already has. It's distorted math, but extremely persuasive. This flaw also explains why certain fears persist even when we already know rationally that they don't make sense. Reason understands. The body doesn't. The conscious mind says everything is fine, while the internal system remains on alert. It's a silent conflict between layers of the mind itself. And this conflict generates anxiety, tension, and a constant feeling that something is out of place, even when it isn't. When we begin to understand this phenomenon, something changes. Not because fear disappears, but because it loses its status as absolute truth. It comes to be seen as a signal, not from the world but from the internal workings of the brain. This opens the way for a different journey. A journey of observation, questioning, and more conscious choices. After all, not every perceived threat deserves an automatic reaction. There is power in perceiving the inner workings of your own reactions. In understanding that many decisions are made even before you consciously participate in them. This understanding is not about total control but about progressive awareness. Each time you recognize this mechanism in action, you create a small pause between stimulus and response. And it is in this pause that new possibilities arise. The more we delve into it, the clearer it becomes that this flaw is not an isolated defect but part of a larger system. A system that shapes mindset, influences choices, and defines how we interpret reality. A system that, when left unquestioned, begins to run life on autopilot. But when observed, it begins to reveal its patterns, its distortions, and its limitations. And that's precisely where this investigation becomes even more interesting. Because if the brain is capable of creating threats where they don't exist, what else might it be creating without you realizing it? What other interpretations are being taken as truth? What other decisions are being influenced by distorted signals? This is not a comfortable question, but it's a necessary one. And the more you allow it to resonate, the more layers begin to reveal themselves. Fear ceases to be just an enemy to be fought and becomes a clue, an indication of something deeper happening behind the scenes of the mind. If all of this resonates with you in any way, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because, to understand why the brain exaggerates threats today, we need to go back much further than we imagine. Long before cities, technology, meetings, cell phone messages, or the complex decisions of the modern world. We need to go back to a time when human life depended on a single skill: survive. Imagine a primitive setting. A hostile, unpredictable environment where every different sound could signify real danger. A crackling sound in the bushes wasn't curiosity, it was risk. A shadow out of place wasn't a detail, it was a warning. In this world, there was no room for long doubts or deep analysis. Those who overthought often didn't survive. The human brain was shaped in this context, calibrated to react quickly, always be suspicious, and act before being certain. The logic was simple, almost brutal. It's better to flee from a danger that doesn't exist than to ignore a real one. If the brain misinterpreted a noise as a threat, the worst that happened was a waste of energy. But if you misinterpreted a predator, the cost could be your life. This math shaped our biology. Fear became an evolutionary advantage. Hypervigilance became protection. Exaggeration became strategy. This system worked. It saved lives. It ensured continuity. It was an efficient solution for a world where risk was constant and concrete. The problem is that the world has changed, and the brain hasn't kept pace with this change. It still operates with old parameters, as if it were surrounded by immediate physical dangers. But today most threats no longer come from the wild. They come from social, emotional, and symbolic situations. Even so, the brain reacts as if it were facing a real attack. Criticism can sound like fatal rejection. A mistake can seem like the end of everything. Silence can be interpreted as abandonment. The system that once protected us begins to distort our perception of reality. It doesn't distinguish well between a lurking lion and a misinterpreted email. For it, a threat is a threat. This is the origin of the error. Not a recent flaw, but a system too old for the modern world. A powerful mechanism, efficient in its time, but misaligned with the kind of challenges we face today. The brain continues to prioritize survival, even when what is at stake is not life, but image, belonging, the future, or control. And this is where the transformation begins to happen, not in the brain itself, but in how we understand its workings. When we realize that many automatic reactions are remnants of a distant past, something shifts internally. Fear ceases to be an absolute truth and becomes a reflection of a system trying to apply old rules to new problems. This imbalance has a direct impact on the decisions we make. It influences career choices, relationships, important changes, and even how we handle opportunities. How many times has your brain pulled the brakes before you even tried? How many times has the perceived risk been greater than the actual risk? This isn't a lack of courage. It's a biological inheritance. There's a hidden truth in all of this. The brain wasn't designed to make us happy, fulfilled, or peaceful. It was designed to keep us alive. Any feeling of excessive security is suspicious to it. Any novelty can represent a threat. That's why changes often generate discomfort even when they are positive. The internal system prefers the known, even if limiting, to the unknown, even if transformative. When we understand this, we begin to see behind the scenes of our own reactions. Anxiety ceases to be a mysterious enemy and becomes a sign of a system operating out of context. Exaggerated fear is not weakness, it's an old alarm going off in a new environment. This understanding doesn't eliminate fear, but it changes our relationship with it. Throughout this journey of understanding, it becomes clear that the brain doesn't lie maliciously. It doesn't create distortions to harm. It does the best it can with the tools it has. The problem is that these tools were honed in a world that no longer exists. A world where the threat was external, visible, and immediate. Today many threats are internal, subjective, and interpretive. This clash between past and present generates tension. It generates internal conflict. It generates the feeling of always being on alert, even when there is no real danger. And the more modern life demands quick decisions, social exposure, and constant adaptation, the more this system is activated. The result is an overloaded brain trying to protect itself from everything all the time. But understanding this origin changes the game. Because when you understand where the reaction comes from, you gain space to question it. You begin to realize that not every impulse needs to be followed. That not every feeling of threat deserves an immediate response. A small pause emerges, and in that pause lies the choice. The possibility of responding differently. Of building a mindset more aligned with current reality, and not with a distant past. This awareness isn't instantaneous. It's built. It's a journey of observation, adjustments, and gradual revelations. Each time you recognize your brain reacting as if it were in danger, even when it isn't, you weaken the automatic power of that system a little. Not by fighting against it, but by understanding its limits. And the more you observe, the more questions arise. If the brain exaggerates threats to ensure survival, what happens when it starts doing this all the time? How does this pattern affect the way you see the world, people, and yourself? What decisions are being made based on fears that no longer make sense in the current context? These questions don't demand quick answers. They demand attention, presence, and a willingness to look beyond the initial reaction. Because understanding the origin of the error is only the beginning. There is still much to be revealed about how this system operates, how it manifests itself in daily life, and how it influences behavior without asking permission. If all of this resonates with you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the origin of this error is important, but understanding it is even more important. How it works in real time inside your body. It completely changes the way you perceive fear. This is where the phenomenon ceases to be abstract and becomes visceral, physical, impossible to ignore. When the brain interprets something as a threat, even if that threat doesn't actually exist, it doesn't ask for permission from reason. It doesn't wait for careful analysis, it doesn't consult arguments, it doesn't ask questions. It acts. And it acts fast. In milliseconds, an internal system is activated as if a real danger were in front of it. An invisible alarm goes off, and the body goes into emergency mode. Perhaps you've felt this before without realizing the exact reason. Your heart starts beating faster, as if it needs to pump blood for an imminent escape. Your muscles contract, preparing your body for action. A strange sense of urgency arises, as if something needs to be resolved now, immediately, even if you don't know what. It's not your imagination. It's your body reacting before your mind can keep up. This is the central point of the failure. The body believes before reason. For the brain, the interpretation is already sufficient to justify the response. It doesn't wait for external confirmation. If something seems dangerous, he treats it as if it's dangerous. The internal alarm doesn't distinguish well between reality and possibility. It reacts to what if, not to what is. And this explains why many reactions seem disproportionate. Why a simple comment can generate intense discomfort. Why silence can cause anxiety. Why a common situation can be experienced as a threat. The system is not interested in context or intention. It is interested in preventing harm. And, for it, prevention means exaggeration. This automatic response was designed for extreme situations. In a hostile environment, there was no time to think about whether the noise was wind or a predator. The accelerated heart rate, muscle tension, and immediate readiness were advantages. But in today's world, this same mechanism is activated by much more subtle stimuli. A different look, an ambiguous message, a possibility of error. The body reacts as if it were in physical danger, even when the risk is only symbolic. The most curious thing is that, after the alarm goes off, the conscious mind kicks in, trying to explain what has already happened. It creates narratives to justify the body's reaction. Something is wrong. This doesn't seem safe. It's better to avoid it. And these explanations seem so convincing that they are rarely questioned. The sensation comes first. The story comes later. This is where many decisions are made without you realizing it. Decisions to retreat, to remain silent, to not act. The brain associates the physical sensation of discomfort with the idea of danger and registers it as something to be avoided in the future. Thus, the alarm not only goes off, it learns. It learns quickly. And it starts reacting earlier and earlier with less and less stimulus. This cycle has a profound impact on mindset. It creates a constant perception of risk, even in safe environments. The body lives in a state of alert, and the mind begins to interpret the world from that state. Everything seems more intense, more urgent, more threatening. Reality is filtered through a system that prioritizes protection over clarity. There is a hidden truth in all of this that is rarely stated directly. Fear doesn't arise because something is dangerous. It arises because the body has already decided that it is. Reason often arrives later, trying to catch up. And when reason arrives late, it tends to accept the decision already made instead of questioning it. This mechanism explains why it's so difficult to think rationally when we're anxious or afraid. It's not a lack of intelligence or willpower. It's biology in action. The brain puts the body in a state of maximum alert and reduces the space for reflection. The priority is not to understand but to react. And the more times this pattern repeats itself, the more automatic it becomes. But observing this process is already an act of transformation. Realizing that an accelerated heartbeat is not proof of danger. That muscle tension is not confirmation of a threat. That a sense of urgency does not mean that something needs to be resolved now. These sensations are signs of an old system doing what it has always done, protecting. Even when it doesn't need to. When you begin to see behind the scenes of this reaction, something changes in the inner journey. Not immediately, not magically, but subtly and continuously. A small space emerges between the stimulus and the response. An interval where awareness can enter. Where the question can arise, is this really a danger, or just the alarm going off? This simple, silent question has an enormous impact. It doesn't silence the body, but it prevents the automatic reaction from becoming absolute truth. It returns some control. And little by little, it changes the way decisions are made. Fear ceases to be the invisible director of experience and becomes just another signal to be interpreted. The deeper we delve, the clearer it becomes that this internal alarm isn't a villain. It's an ancient guardian using ancient tools in a world that has changed too quickly. Understanding this isn't about eliminating fear, but about contextualizing it. About separating sensation from reality. About building a mindset that recognizes fear without being dominated by it. And as this understanding deepens, a new layer begins to reveal itself. Because if the body reacts as if the danger were already real, what happens when this state becomes the norm? How does this shape behaviors, choices, and the way you see yourself in the world? These questions begin to arise naturally, demanding attention, not quick answers. If this part of what was said resonates with you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's when we bring this into real life that everything takes shape, gains weight, and becomes recognized. Up to this point, we've talked about systems, mechanisms, and internal reactions. But it's in everyday life, in the seemingly banal details, that this error of the brain reveals itself most forcefully. It's there that many people begin to notice, almost silently, this happens to me too. Think about the fear of rejection. Not that conscious, declared fear, but the subtle, almost automatic fear that arises before you expose yourself. Before you speak your mind. Before you disagree. Before you show who you really are. The brain goes on alert as if rejection were expulsion from the group, as if it meant loss of protection, isolation, real risk. The body reacts. The heart races. The mind creates scenarios. And without realizing it, you become silent, you adapt, you diminish yourself. Not because something bad is happening, but because the brain predicts that could happen. The same thing happens with social anxiety. An environment with unfamiliar people, a meeting, a simple informal conversation. Nothing there is objectively dangerous. Yet, the body reacts as if it were in hostile territory. Tension in the shoulders, shortness of breath, a feeling of being constantly evaluated. The primitive brain interprets neutral glances as judgment. Silences as disapproval. Vague expressions as a threat. The danger is not in the environment, it's in the distorted reading that the system makes of it. And perhaps one of the most current and recognizable examples is the feeling of receiving an unexpected message. A notification that appears without context. I need to talk to you. An audio message that's too short. In seconds, the mind races. The body reacts. The heart accelerates. The imagination takes over. The brain doesn't wait for the real information to arrive. It fills the void with the worst possible scenario. Because, for it, uncertainty is risk. And risk demands immediate preparation. This is when catastrophizing kicks in. The automatic tendency to imagine that everything will go wrong. That the problem is bigger than it seems. That something serious is about to happen. This pattern doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's the direct consequence of a brain trained to anticipate threats. A brain that prefers to exaggerate the impact of danger rather than risk being caught off guard. The result is a mind that lives a few steps ahead of reality, almost always anticipating the worst possible outcome. When you look at these examples, it's hard not to recognize something familiar. Because they are part of the modern experience. They are not exceptions. They are patterns. Patterns created by an ancient brain trying to operate in a complex, socially dense and emotionally ambiguous world. A world where most threats cannot be countered with fight or flight, but the body keeps trying to respond as if it could. The impact of this is profound. It affects decisions both small and large. It affects career choices, relationships, personal initiatives. How many opportunities are avoided not due to a lack of ability, but because of a diffuse sense of danger? How many times does the brain construct such a convincing narrative that you come to believe it without questioning? This is the hidden truth behind many blocks. It's not the world that limits you, it's your automatic interpretation of it. There's something almost ironic about all this. The same system that once guaranteed survival now creates invisible obstacles. It protects, but it also imprisons. It warns, but it also exaggerates. And the less aware we are of this process, the more it operates behind the scenes, shaping mindsets, reinforcing fears and guiding decisions without asking permission. It is precisely this invisible layer that needs to be illuminated. Because when you begin to recognize these patterns as automatic responses, and not as absolute truths, something shifts internally. Fear doesn't disappear, but it loses authority. It ceases to be a command and becomes a signal. Data to be observed, not an order to be followed. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not fear as a superficial concept, but the deep workings of the human mind. The hidden mechanisms that transform neutral stimuli into threats and sensations into certainties. Looking at this is not comfortable, but it is transformative. Because it brings clarity where there was previously confusion. Throughout this journey, many people realize they've spent years reacting to dangers that never materialized. That they carried unnecessary tension. That they made decisions based on imagined scenarios. This realization isn't meant to generate guilt, but to create space. Space for more conscious choices. For less automatic responses. For a different relationship with one's own fear. And the more you observe these examples in your daily life, the more you begin to notice repeated patterns. Different situations, similar reactions. The body reacting before the mind. The mind justifying afterward. This cycle repeats until something interrupts the flow. Until consciousness enters the scene and asks the question that changes everything. Is this really a threat, or does it just seem like one? This question doesn't solve everything, but it starts a process. A silent transformation process, where each perception weakens the automatic dominance of fear a little. Where the mindset begins to align more with the reality of the present than with ghosts of the past. Where decisions begin to be made with more clarity and less illusory urgency. And as this awareness grows, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because if the brain creates modern threats from old systems, what happens when these reactions accumulate over time? What kind of impact does this have on how you live, choose, and position yourself in the world? These questions linger, demanding continuity, further exploration, and new revelations. If these examples touched on something personal for you, comment below. This happens to me too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after understanding everyday examples, an inevitable question arises. What does all this have to do with how you live, choose, and react to the world? This is where the invisible effect of this flaw becomes most evident. Not as an isolated event, but as a silent thread that runs through decisions, behaviors, and entire paths, often unnoticed. When the brain overestimates threats, it doesn't just create momentary fear. It creates patterns, avoidance patterns, negative anticipation, and overprotection. Gradually, almost silently, opportunities begin to be discarded before they are even considered. Invitations are not accepted. Ideas are not presented. Changes are postponed. Not because the person doesn't want to grow, but because the body sends signals of risk before reason can clearly assess the situation. The most curious thing is that, internally, this is often interpreted as prudence, as caution, as maturity. But often it's just the old alarm doing its job, keeping everything as it is because the known seems safer than the unknown. Even when the known no longer makes sense. Even when stagnation generates frustration. The brain prefers limited predictability to the imagined risk of transformation. Another silent impact appears in how we interpret the behavior of others. Neutrality becomes a threat. A neutral tone is read as coldness. A short answer is seen as disapproval. The absence of reaction is understood as rejection. The brain, trained to look for signs of danger, fills in the gaps with negative meanings. Not because they are there, but because it cannot tolerate uncertainty. This type of interpretation creates constant noise in relationships. Conflicts that never existed. Tensions that could be avoided. distances that arise without real reason. And once again, everything happens behind the scenes. The person reacts to a threat that only exists in their own internal interpretation of the situation. The emotional response comes before the conversation, before the verification, before reality. And when the alarm goes off, the body chooses a familiar path: defense, attack, or flight. Sometimes this manifests as excessive silence, withdrawal, avoidance of contact. Other times it appears as irritation, curt responses, a need for control. In some cases, it becomes complete withdrawal, abandonment of situations or people. These reactions seem like conscious choices, but often they are just automatic responses from a system trying to protect itself. It's important to make something very clear here. This is not weakness, that it's not a lack of emotional intelligence. It's not an inability to cope with life. It's biology. It's a brain doing exactly what it's been trained to do over thousands of years. The problem isn't the reaction itself, but the context in which it's applied. A system created to survive in hostile environments ends up overreacting in environments that demand nuance, dialogue, and finer interpretation. This invisible effect also shapes mindset over time. When many decisions are made out of fear, the world begins to seem naturally more dangerous than it actually is. Expectations become negative. The gaze becomes trained to focus on the problem, not the possibility. Life's journey is guided by detours, not by conscious choices. And this generates a cumulative impact that is difficult to perceive while it is happening. Many people look back and feel they could have gone further, tried harder, lived more. But they can't pinpoint exactly where they went wrong. Because there wasn't one big mistake. There were hundreds of small, silent setbacks. Small decisions shaped by an alarm that went off for no real reason. That's the power of this failure. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And by whispering repeatedly, it ends up directing entire paths. There's a hidden truth in this process that's rarely confronted. The brain doesn't clearly differentiate between safety and stagnation. To it, both can seem the same. As long as the apparent danger is avoided, the system considers the mission accomplished. It doesn't matter if this means giving up growth, connection, or fulfillment. The priority remains protection. When this dynamic is understood, something begins to move internally. Not in the sense of eliminating fear, but overestimate. Fear ceases to be the primary decision-making criterion. It becomes just one piece of data among many. Information that can be observed, questioned, and contextualized. This change is subtle but profoundly transformative. From this point on, decisions begin to take on a different weight. The impulse to avoid is perceived as an impulse, not as truth. The automatic reaction is perceived before it becomes behavior. The space between stimulus and response begins to widen. And in this space something new is born: choice. Conscious choice. Choice aligned with current reality, not with ghosts inherited from a distant past. This is not a quick journey. It's a process. A fine-tuning that happens little by little, as the inner workings of the mind are illuminated. Each insight reduces the invisible power of this alarm a little. Each understanding brings more clarity about who is in control: automatic fear or present awareness. And the more this clarity sets in, the more evident it becomes that the impact of this failure goes far beyond isolated moments. It influences entire trajectories. It shapes personal stories. It defines internal boundaries. Therefore, looking at this mechanism is not just scientific curiosity. It is an important step towards a more honest relationship with one's own decisions and behaviors. If all of this is connecting in some way, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after seeing the invisible impact of this flaw on decisions and behaviors, a central question arises that ties everything that has been said so far together. Why does the brain insist so much on exaggerating? What is the logic behind this that makes an unlikely threat seem more important than dozens of safety signs all around? The answer lies in something we might call the mathematics of fear. And it doesn't work like the rational logic we use to solve everyday problems. The brain doesn't calculate what is most likely to happen. It calculates what would be most dangerous. With it could happen and be ignored. That difference completely changes the game. For the brain, probability is secondary. Severity is the priority. A small but potentially devastating threat outweighs several safe situations. Even if the chance of something bad happening is minimal, if the impact is high, the internal system treats it as urgent. It's as if the brain is saying, it doesn't matter if it's rare, if it happens, I can't be caught off guard. This logic makes sense when we think about physical survival. Ignoring a rare predator could be fatal. Reacting to a non-existent danger, on the other hand, only costs energy. So the brain learned to choose exaggeration as a strategy. It's better to be unnecessarily frightened 100 times than to make a single mistake when the risk is real. This equation worked in the past. Today it generates constant distortions. In the modern world, many threats have an emotional, social, or symbolic impact, not a physical one. Yet the brain reacts as if the consequence were extreme. Criticism becomes a threat to identity. A mistake becomes a risk of exclusion. A conflict becomes a sign of collapse. The system doesn't evaluate statistics, context, or history. It evaluates extreme scenarios. And it chooses to protect itself from them, even if they never materialize. This mathematics of fear explains why catastrophic thoughts arise so easily. What if everything goes wrong? What if I fail? What if this ends me? Not because these scenarios are likely, but because, in the logic of the brain, the cost of ignoring them seems too high. So he puts them in the spotlight, even though there is no concrete evidence that they will happen. There's a hidden truth in all of this. The brain treats the worst-case scenario as a warning, not as a hypothesis. It doesn't present the thought as a possibility, but as something that deserves an immediate reaction. And when the body reacts, racing heart, tension, urgency, the mind interprets this as confirmation. If I'm feeling this, there must be a reason. Thus, sensation becomes proof. Fear becomes truth. This mechanism creates a powerful bias. The more intense the fear, the more real the danger seems. The more real the danger seems, the more the brain reinforces the response. It's a self-perpetuating, closed cycle. And, without realizing it, the person begins to live guided by improbable, but emotionally charged, scenarios. The journey becomes guided by preventing the worst, not by building what is possible. This logic also explains why rational arguments don't always work when someone is dominated by fear. Showing statistics, probabilities, or concrete facts doesn't calm the system. Because the brain isn't interested in averages or normality. It's focused on the dangerous exception. The one that, if ignored, could cause irreversible damage. The result is a constantly threat-oriented mindset. The gaze becomes trained to detect risks. Attention is fixed on what could go wrong. The perception of reality narrows. Everything is filtered through the silent question, where is the danger? This way of seeing the world is not a conscious choice. It is a direct consequence of this internal equation. Over time, this profoundly shapes decisions. Not choosing something begins to seem safer than choosing it. Not acting seems smarter than taking a risk. The brain values the absence of immediate threat above any future gain, even when that gain represents growth, learning, or transformation. Momentary security trumps the possibility of evolution. But there's an important point here. Understanding this math isn't about challenging the brain or trying to eliminate it. It's about recognizing its limitations. The brain performs quick but simplified calculations. It doesn't take into account nuance, context, personal history, or conscious learning. It works with shortcuts. And these shortcuts, while efficient for survival, are not ideal for the complex decisions of modern life. When this understanding takes hold, something begins to change behind the scenes. Fear ceases to be interpreted as an infallible oracle. It begins to be seen as an exaggerated warning, based on an outdated calculation. A calculation that prioritizes the worst possible scenario, not the most likely one. This distinction is subtle but powerful. From there, space opens up for a new internal question. Is this really as dangerous as it seems, or does it only seem dangerous because the brain is applying outdated logic? This question doesn't eliminate fear, but it reduces its automatic power. It interrupts the cycle before it closes completely. And, little by little, it creates a different relationship with one's own reactions. This change doesn't happen all at once. It's part of an ongoing journey of observation and adjustment. Each time you perceive the mathematics of fear in action, you gain a little more clarity. Each time you recognize that an unlikely threat has unnecessarily gained top priority, something reorganizes itself internally. The mindset begins to align more with the reality of the present than with extreme projections. And the more this awareness deepens, the more evident it becomes that the brain is not an enemy to be fought, but a system to be understood. A powerful, efficient, but imperfect system. One that needs context, reflection, and awareness so as not to completely dominate decisions. This understanding opens space for more balanced choices, less guided by automatic fear and more connected to what is really happening. This silent mathematics of fear continues to operate, even when you don't realize it. But when it begins to be observed, it loses some of the invisible power it had. And this naturally leads us to an even deeper layer of this process, where perception, control, and the real possibility of inner change come into play. If this logic makes sense to you, comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything that has been said so far leads us, almost inevitably, to a silent turning point. A point that makes no noise, promises no miracles, but completely changes how this story is experienced from the inside. It's the moment when realizing the mistake begins to change the game. Understanding this flaw in the brain doesn't make the fear disappear. It's important to make that clear. Anyone who promises a total absence of fear is selling an illusion. Fear continues to arise, the body still reacts, the internal alarm can still go off. The difference is that something fundamental changes. Fear ceases to be the deciding factor. He loses automatic control. And that changes everything. There is an almost imperceptible instant in which this change occurs. A small interval between the automatic impulse and the conscious response. Before, this space practically didn't exist. The stimulus arose, the body reacted, the mind justified it, and the action happened. Everything in sequence, too fast to be questioned. When consciousness enters the scene, this flow ceases to be inevitable. This is the true awakening. It's not about facing fear head-on, nor about forcing artificial courage. It's about perceiving the mechanism at work as it happens. Feeling your heart race and at the same time recognizing, this is the alarm. Noticing the tension in your body and thinking, my brain is interpreting something as a threat. This simple identification already creates distance. And distance creates choice. At that moment, something profound happens behind the scenes of the mind. The automatic impulse is still there, but it is no longer mistaken for truth. It becomes a signal, a piece of data, biological information. The conscious response gains space to exist. Not to deny the fear but to engage with it. To ask, is this really a danger now or does it only seem to be? That space between impulse and response is where real transformation resides. Because it's there that decisions begin to change in nature. They are no longer decisions made to silence immediate discomfort, but choices aligned with what makes sense in the long term. The old brain wants quick relief. Consciousness allows for a broader perspective. And this difference redefines entire trajectories. Many people confuse control with repression. They think that controlling fear means not feeling it. But true control comes from understanding. When you understand the mistake, you don't need to fight against it all the time. You begin to recognize it. And recognition is a form of silent freedom. Fear appears, but it doesn't drag automatic action along with it. This awakening also changes the relationship with one's own body. Sensations that were previously interpreted as signs of danger are now seen as predictable physiological responses. A racing heart ceases to be a catastrophic warning. Muscle tension ceases to be a death sentence. Urgency loses its power to command. The body continues to react, but the mind no longer immediately hands over the steering wheel. This change is subtle but profoundly emotional. Because for the first time the person realizes they are not broken. They are not weak. They are not incapable. They are simply operating with an old system in a new world. This understanding brings relief. It brings clarity. It brings a new mindset, less based on guilt and more based on understanding. Throughout this journey, many begin to notice small, unseen victories. A moment when they don't avoid a situation. An instant when they choose to respond instead of react. A decision made despite fear, not against it. These changes seem small but they accumulate impact. They reconfigure patterns. And patterns shape lives. There is a hidden truth in this awakening that is rarely spoken. Fear loses its power when it ceases to be interpreted as identity. It is not who you are. It is something that happens within you. This distinction completely changes the internal dialogue. Instead of I am like this, it becomes my brain is doing this right now. And this shift in internal language alters the weight of the experience. Over time, awareness begins to act almost like a shock absorber. It doesn't prevent the impact, but it reduces the damage. The impulse still comes, but it doesn't determine the outcome. The conscious response can choose to wait, observe, question, adjust. And this ability to adjust, even amidst discomfort, is one of the most transformative skills a human being can develop. This is the point where the video ceases to be merely informative and becomes emotionally significant. Because what's at stake here isn't just understanding a strange brain phenomenon. It's realizing that there's room for maneuver. That there's internal space. That not everything needs to be decided in the heat of the moment. This realization gives back something precious, autonomy. And when this autonomy begins to be felt, new questions naturally arise. If recognizing the mistake already changes the game, what happens when this awareness deepens even further? What changes when you start applying this awareness consistently? How does this impact choices, relationships, identity, and worldview over time? These questions don't demand immediate answers. They demand continuity, observation, honest curiosity, because awakening is not a single event. It's a layered process. And each layer revealed further widens the gap between automatic impulse and conscious response. If this emotional turning point is resonating with you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after everything that has been revealed so far, something begins to settle within the listener. Not as a closed answer, but as a silent unease. A feeling that many things that seemed obvious may never have been so simple after all. It is at this point that fear ceases to be merely a reaction and becomes an invitation to reflection. Throughout life, we are taught to trust fear as if it were a reliable guide. If you're scared, something must be wrong. If your body reacts, it's dangerous. This logic seems intuitive, almost natural. But when we look more closely, we realize it ignores an essential detail. Fear is not born in the world. It is born in the interpretation we make of the world, and interpretations can be wrong. How many times have you felt afraid of something that you later realized posed no real threat? How many decisions have been avoided, postponed, or abandoned because of a feeling that seemed urgent but never materialized in reality? These questions are not accusatory. They are revealing. Because they point to a truth we rarely confront. Not all fear carries wisdom. The brain has learned to protect itself by exaggerating. It has learned to react quickly, to anticipate extreme scenarios, to treat uncertainties as risks. This learning was essential in a world where danger was concrete and immediate. But today, many of the situations that trigger the alarm do not put survival at risk. They challenge identity, comfort, control. Yet, the body responds as if it were facing something fatal. This mismatch creates a confusing internal experience. Fear seems real because it's felt in the body. Tension is real. Discomfort is real. Urgency is real. But the threat often is not. And this difference changes everything. Because when we confuse sensation with reality, we entrust our decisions to a system that wasn't designed to handle the complexity of the modern world. This has a profound impact on how we live. Little by little, without realizing it, we reduce our scope of action. Avoiding the new. Preferring the predictable. Interpreting neutral signals as risks. Fear becomes a constant filter of experience. And when it becomes a filter, reality seems smaller, narrower, more dangerous than it really is. But something begins to change when this logic is exposed. When you understand that fear is an echo, not an oracle. An echo of an ancient brain trying to apply ancient strategies to modern challenges. This understanding doesn't eliminate fear, but it alters the place it occupies. It ceases to be the commander and becomes the messenger. And messages can be interpreted, not just obeyed. This is a delicate point in the journey because it demands inner honesty. It requires recognizing that many emotional certainties were built on unstable foundations. That many automatic reactions do not reflect real danger, but conditioning. This realization can cause discomfort, but it also brings freedom. Because if fear is not always a reliable warning, then there is room for more conscious choices. The most interesting thing is that this change doesn't happen dramatically. It takes hold gradually. In small pauses. In moments of observation. In instants when you feel fear arising, but decide not to act immediately. In decisions that would previously have been avoided and are now simply evaluated more calmly. That's how the mindset begins to reorganize itself. Over time, something subtle happens behind the scenes. The brain continues to send out alerts, but they lose intensity. Not because the system has been switched off, but because it has become contextualized. Fear ceases to be interpreted as a sign of absolute truth and begins to be seen as a hypothesis. One possibility among many. And this changes the emotional weight of the experience. This change has a direct impact on how you see yourself. The feeling of fragility gives way to understanding. Internal judgment diminishes. The narrative shifts from "I can't handle this" to "my brain is reacting this way, and I can choose how to respond." This change in perspective is one of the most silent and powerful transformations someone can experience. Upon reaching this point, it becomes clear that fear doesn't need to be fought or eliminated. It needs to be understood. It needs to be placed in the right context. Because when fear is treated as absolute truth, it limits. When it's treated as a biological signal, it informs. This difference redefines the relationship with one's own internal experience. And perhaps the most provocative aspect of all this is realizing that many barriers never existed in the external world. They were built through automatic interpretations reinforced over time. This doesn't invalidate the pain felt, nor does it minimize the emotional impact of these experiences. On the contrary, it gives them meaning. It shows that there was a logic behind them, even if that logic no longer applies today. This perception leaves a question hanging in the air, one that doesn't demand an immediate answer, but invites continuous observation. How many times have you treated fear as a warning when it was just an echo? This question doesn't close anything. It opens things up. It creates space for new revelations, new understandings, new ways of dealing with what arises from within. Because, in the end, and this is something worth taking with you, not all fear is a warning. Sometimes, it's just an echo of your brain trying to protect you from a danger that no longer exists. If this thought has been nagging at you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. And if you've made it this far, you may have already realized that this video wasn't just about fear. It was about perception. About the invisible inner workings of the mind that shape choices, silence desires, and sometimes make us retreat before even trying. If this touched you in any way, I invite you, not as an obligation, but as a natural continuation of this conversation, to subscribe to the channel. This space exists to delve deeper into these reflections, to name what is almost never said, and to transform confusion into clarity. If this message reached you at the right time, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." It's a simple yet powerful sign that this journey made sense to you too. And if, at some point, you felt that silent connection, that feeling of, "That's me," the like, comes as a natural consequence. It helps this type of content continue to exist and reach those who need to hear it. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic. If something resonated with you, click on it and continue watching. Sometimes, the next answer doesn't come from silence. It comes from the next step. Because ultimately, the question that opened this video still lingers. How many times have you called something a danger when it was just an echo? This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,